Hello, and welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Take a moment now to find your place of rest. Let go of the day's concerns and allow the weight of your body to settle completely. Soften your shoulders, relax your jaw, and bring your awareness to the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. In and out, a gentle tide that carries you away from the noise of the present. If you use these to fall asleep, go ahead and hit subscribe so you never miss one. And let me know in the comments, what time is it where you are right now? Tonight, we journey north. We travel back through time to a land of deep fjords, dark forests, and a long, unforgiving winter. We are going to the world of the Norse people, a world we have come to call the Viking Age. The very word conjures images of dragon-headed longships crashing through icy seas, of horned helmets and fierce warriors, of raids and plunder. But these dramatic images, born from the terror of their victims and the romance of later sagas, tell only a fraction of the story. They are the fiery sparks that leap from a much larger, slower-burning fire. The truth of the Viking Age, the reality for the vast majority of the Norse people, was not a life of adventure and conquest. It was a life tied to the soil, a life of relentless, back-breaking labor, governed by the turning of the seasons and the ever-present threat of starvation. It was a life of profound resilience, of deep faith in a complex pantheon of gods, and a quiet, stoic endurance. Tonight, we will explore that world. We will set aside the legends of the great warriors and instead seek the story of the farmer, the builder, the person whose hands created the foundation upon which that entire age was built. So, as you settle deeper into comfort, let your mind become still. Allow the story to unfold at its own unhurried pace. Our journey begins now, on a small plot of land, on the edge of a fjord, in the heart of 9th century Norway. The grueling grind, daily life of a Viking farmer. Imagine yourself here, not as a warrior, not as a raider, but as a carl. You are a free man, the owner of your own small farmstead, Olgar. You are the backbone of the society, a member of the great, broad middle class that forms the foundation of the Norse world. Your name is not known to history. Your deeds will not be sung by the skalds in the great halls of kings. Your life is a story written not in runes on a memorial stone, but in the calluses on your hands and the deep lines etched on your face by the wind and the sun. Your day does not begin with the crowing of a rooster, but with a subtle change in the quality of the light filtering through the smoke hole in the roof of your longhouse. It is a slow, gray dawn that arrives late and seems reluctant to stay. You awaken not in a private room, but in the main, open space of the longhouse, on a raised wooden platform that runs along the wall. You are sleeping on a mattress of hay or straw, covered by a heavy woolen blanket and the thick pelt of a sheep or a deer. The air inside the longhouse is cool and thick. It carries a complex tapestry of smells that are the very essence of your existence. The lingering scent of last night's wood fire, the musty odor of the damp earth floor, the subtle aroma of drying herbs hanging from the rafters, the milky scent of the livestock that shares this building with your family, and the ever-present underlying smell of wood smoke that has seeped into every timber, every piece of cloth, every strand of your hair. The space is shared by your entire household. Your spouse and children sleep nearby. In a separate, partitioned area at one end of the longhouse, you can hear the soft rustling and low sounds of your precious livestock. A few cows, a handful of sheep, perhaps a goat. In this harsh northern climate, your animals are your wealth, your security. To leave them outside overnight would be to invite disaster from the biting cold or from predators, both animal and human, that roam the deep forests. This shared living space is not a hardship. It is a practical and necessary reality, a huddle of warmth and life against the vast, indifferent wilderness outside. You rise from your sleeping platform, your bare feet meeting the cold, packed earth of the floor. Your clothes are simple and functional, made of coarse, undyed wool or vermeil. You pull on a linen undertunic, followed by a thick woolen tunic and trousers. The wool is scratchy against your skin, but it is incredibly warm, and its natural lanolin oils make it water-resistant, a vital quality in this damp climate. On your feet, you wear simple leather shoes, little more than a single piece of hide folded around your foot and secured with a leather thong. Your first task is to tend to the fire. In the center of a longhouse is a long hearth, a shallow stone-lined pit that runs down the middle of the floor. The embers from last night have burned low, a bed of gray ash with a few glowing sparks deep within. You carefully add small, dry twigs and then larger pieces of split wood, coaxing the fire back to life. This fire is the heart of your home. It provides your only light in the long hours of darkness. It is where all your food is cooked, and its radiant heat is the only thing that holds the bone-deep chill of the Norwegian winter at bay. As the fire grows, casting a flickering, golden light through the smoky gloom of the longhouse, the first meal of the day, the dagmel, is prepared. It is a simple, monotonous, but life-sustaining meal. It is almost always a porridge, or grauta, made from oats or barley, boiled with water or milk from your own cow. Sometimes, it might be supplemented with a handful of dried berries gathered in the summer, or a dollop of honey if you are fortunate enough to have a beehive. You and your family eat from simple carved wooden bowls, using spoons made of wood or animal horn. There is no talk of what you might prefer to eat. You eat what is available, what you have managed to preserve from the last harvest. You eat to gain the strength for the day's labor, a long and arduous series of tasks that follows the unyielding rhythm of the seasons. Let us imagine it is late spring. The long, oppressive darkness of winter has finally receded. The snow has melted from the fields, leaving the ground wet and heavy. The air is still cold, but it carries a new scent, the smell of damp earth and awakening life. For you, this is the most critical time of the year. The survival of your family through the next winter depends entirely on the work you do now. You leave the relative warmth of the longhouse and step outside. The air hits you with a clean, sharp cold. Your farm is a small clearing carved out of the immense forest, nestled on a patch of relatively flat land on the edge of a deep, dark fjord. The fjord itself is a vast chasm of icy salt water, its surface like polished slate, reflecting the towering, snow-dusted mountains that rise almost vertically from its shores. Your world is one of immense vertical beauty, but for a farmer, it is a difficult and unforgiving landscape. There is very little flat, arable land. The soil is thin, rocky, and acidic. Your main field, your ack, is small, perhaps only a few acres. Your first task is to prepare it for planting. The plow you use is a simple wooden ord, a light, wheelless plow that does not turn the soil over but simply cuts a shallow furrow into it. It is pulled by your most prized possession, a pair of oxen. Guiding the ord is grueling work. You lean your full weight onto the handles, trying to keep the furrow straight and deep enough, while you shout commands to the slow, powerful beasts. The ord screeches and groans as it hits the countless rocks hidden just beneath the surface. For every few feet of plowing, you must stop, bend down, and pull a stone from the earth with your bare, cold hands. You toss it onto an ever-growing pile at the edge of the field, a stone wall built not as a fence, but as a repository for the endless harvest of rocks that your land produces. You work from dawn until your back screams in protest, your arms and shoulders aching with the strain of controlling the plow. Once the field is prepared, it is time to plant the precious seeds you have saved from last year's crop. You sow barley and oats, hardy grains that can tolerate the short growing season in the poor soil. You also plant cabbages, onions, and peas in a smaller garden plot closer to the longhouse. Every single seed is a prayer, a gamble against the future. An early frost, a summer drought, a blight. Any one of these could mean disaster. The work of the farm is not limited to the fields. The farmstead itself is in constant need of repair. The roof of your longhouse is made of living turf, laid over a framework of birch bark and wood. It provides excellent insulation, but it requires constant maintenance. You must climb onto the roof to patch areas where the turf has eroded, cutting fresh squares from a nearby pasture and fitting them into place. The wooden walls of the longhouse also need attention. The timbers can rot in the damp climate, and you must check them constantly, replacing a weakened beam here, chinking gaps with a mixture of mud and moss there. Your fences, which keep your livestock from wandering into the forest and protect your small garden from deer, are in constant need of mending. There is always a fence post to replace, always a rail to secure. Your life is an endless battle against entropy, a constant effort to hold back the slow, persistent decay brought on by the wind, the rain, and the frost. The fjord itself is another source of sustenance, another field to be harvested. You own a small boat, a firing, simple and sturdy, propelled by oars. You will often take to the water, rowing out into the deep, cold fjord to fish. You use lines baited with scraps of meat or nets woven from linden bark fiber. You catch cod, haddock, and coalfish. This provides a vital source of protein, a welcome alternative to the endless porridge and bread. But fishing here is not a leisurely activity. The weather on the fjord can change in an instant. A sudden, violent wind, a wind Illinois, can whip up the water, threatening to swamp your small boat. The water is lethally cold. To fall in is to die within minutes. Every trip out onto the fjord is a calculated risk. The food you grow and the fish you catch must be preserved. There is no other way to survive the long winter. You build a small, wooden smokehouse where you hang the fish to be slowly cured over a smoldering fire of alder wood. The meat from any animal that is slaughtered is salted, packed into wooden barrels, and stored in a cool, dark outbuilding. Your grain is dried and stored in a raised storehouse, a stabber, to protect it from rats and moisture. The women of the household spend countless hours grinding the grain by hand into flour, using a heavy, cumbersome rotary quern, a hand mill made of 2 massive stones. This is exhausting, repetitive labor, but it is as essential as plowing the field. Beyond the boundaries of your own farm lies the Utmark, the common land of the forest and the mountains. This is another vital resource. You must venture into the dark, silent forest to gather firewood, the fuel that will keep you from freezing to death in January. You carry a heavy iron axe, and the work of felling trees and chopping them into manageable logs is strenuous and dangerous. In the summer and autumn, your family will spend days in the Utmark gathering other resources, wild berries, mushrooms, and edible roots. You will hunt, if you are able, though the larger game like deer and elk are often preserved with the local chieftain, the owl. More often, you hunt for birds and snare rabbits. Life is lived on a knife edge of sufficiency. A good year, with a long summer and a bountiful harvest, means you will have enough. You will have a surplus of grain, perhaps, that you can trade at the nearest market town for things you cannot produce yourself. A new iron pot, a sharpening stone for your axe, or even a small piece of silver. But a bad year is a catastrophe. A single hailstorm at the wrong time can flatten your entire barley crop. A sick cow can wipe out your family's source of milk and cheese. A poor fishing season means a winter with little protein. There is no larger system to fall back on. There is no state granary to provide relief. You and your family survive or starve based on your own labor, your own foresight, and a great deal of luck. The constant, underlying anxiety is not just about the weather or the harvest. It is about your relationship with power. You are a free man, a Carl, but you live under the authority of the local Jarl. You owe him your loyalty. When he decides to go on a raid, or to wage war against a neighboring chieftain, he may call upon you to join his Levi. You must leave your farm, take up your shield and your spear, and follow him into battle. To refuse is unthinkable. Your absence from the farm during a critical time like planting or harvest could be disastrous, but the Jarl's summons cannot be ignored. He is your landlord, your protector, and your judge. A dispute with a neighbor will be settled at the thing, the local assembly, but the Jarl's influence there is immense. To displease him is to risk everything, your land, your freedom, your life. This is the cycle of your life. It is a world of immense, quiet, and profound labor. It is a life dictated not by the promise of glory, but by the urgent daily need to feed your family and to keep the cold at bay. It is a world of making, mending, growing, and preserving. Every sunrise brings with it a long list of tasks that must be done. Every sunset brings a weary satisfaction and a brief respite of sleep before the cycle begins again. This relentless, grinding rhythm is a deep, unheard drumbeat of the Viking age, a story not of plunder, but of the simple, heroic, and unending struggle for survival on the edge of the world. A life of legend, the story of Eric the Red. The life of the Norse Carl, the free farmer, was one of constant, patient struggle, an effort to endure hardship and maintain his family's place within the delicate social fabric of his community. But what happened when a man's character, his inner fire, was too hot and volatile to be contained by the unwritten rules and legal code of that society? This question brings us to the story of one of the most famous and infamous Norsemen of his age, a man named Eirik Orvaldsson, known to history by a name that likely described both the fiery red color of his hair and beard and his equally fiery, ungovernable temper, Eric the Red. His story begins not in glory, but in disgrace. He was born around the year 950 in the Jæren district of southwestern Norway, a rugged coastal land of wind and stone. He grew up during a time of great change. Powerful kings, most notably Harald Fairhair and his successors, were consolidating their power, imposing taxes, and curtailing the old freedoms of the local chieftains and independent farmers. It was an era of growing tension, where a man of proud and independent spirit might easily run afoul of a new royal authority. And so it was with Eric's father, a man named Orvaldur Asvaldsson. For reasons that are lost to the mists of time, but which the sagas record simply as manslaughter, Orvaldur was exiled from Norway. This was a common punishment in the Norse world, a sentence that was in some ways more dreadful than death. To be exiled was to be stripped of everything: your land, your home, your social standing, your connection to your ancestors. It was to be cast out, forced to make a new life in a new land with nothing but what you could carry. Eric, still just a boy, was forced to share in his father's disgrace. Together, they packed their few belongings onto a ship and sailed west across the cold sea to the stark and formidable land of Iceland. Iceland in the mid-10th century was a new country, a raw frontier, settled by Norsemen fleeing the very royal authority that had exiled Eric's father. It was society built on a fierce and stubborn independence. There was no king in Iceland. The land was governed by a collection of chieftains, or gore, and by the intricate laws laid down at the great National Assembly, the Althing. It was a place of immense opportunity, a land of wide-open valleys where man could carve out a farm and be his own master. But it was also a hard, unforgiving place. The climate was harsher than Norway's, the growing seasons shorter, the landscape dominated by volcanic rock, glacier, and vast, empty highlands. It was a society of proud, quick-tempered people, where insults were not easily forgotten, and disputes over land or honor could quickly escalate into deadly blood feuds. It was, in short, a perfect crucible for a man like Eric the Red. Here, Eric grew to manhood. He married a woman named Jothilda and established his own farmstead, which he named Eirikster. He would have lived the life of an Icelandic farmer, a life very similar to his Norwegian counterpart, but even more difficult. He would have built his long house from turf and stone, as timber was scarce on the island. He would have spent his days clearing the rocky soil, raising hardy sheep and cattle, and hunting for seabirds on the coastal cliffs. He had children, including a son who would one day become even more famous than he, Leif Erikson. For a time, it seemed that Eric had found a place for himself, that the shadow of his father's exile had passed. But the fire in his own temperament could not be contained. The Icelandic sagas, which tell his story, record a series of conflict that would lead to his own downfall. The trouble began, as it so often did, over a small matter that spiraled out of control. Eric owned several thralls, or slaves. One day, These thralls were working on a hillside when they accidentally started a landslide. The cascading rock and soil destroyed the farm of a neighbor named Adolf the Fowl. In retaliation for the destruction of his property, Adolf killed Eric's thralls. For Eric, this was an unforgivable offense. His property had been destroyed. He did not seek justice at the local thing, the legal assembly. He took matters into his own hands. In a fit of rage, he ambushed and killed Adolf the Fowl, as well as another man from his clan. This act of vengeance set in motion the grim and predictable mechanics of the blood feud. The kinsmen of the slain men demanded justice, and Eric was outlawed from the district. He was forced to abandon his farm, Eirikster, and move his family to a new set of islands in a wide fjord to the west. He established a new farm, but his troubles were not over. Before leaving his old home, he had entrusted his setstoker to a new neighbor named Thorgest. These were no ordinary pieces of wood. The setstoker were the great carved pillars that had stood on either side of the high seat in his longhouse. They were sacred heirlooms, symbols of his lineage and his connection to the homeland of Norway, likely brought across the sea by his own father. When Eric felt he was settled in his new home, he went to Thorgest to reclaim his sacred pillars. But Thorgest refused to give them back. Once again, Eric's temper flared. Once again, he bypassed the law and resorted to violence. He went to Thorgest's home, fought his way in, and took the pillars by force. Thorgest gathered his own kinsmen and pursued him. A pitched battle ensued. In the fighting, Eric killed 2 of Thorgest's sons and several other men. This was no longer a minor feud. This was a significant act of violence that could not be ignored by the wider community. This time, the case was brought before the Thorsons Thing, the powerful regional assembly for the area. Eric was put on trial. Given his history and the number of men he had killed, the verdict was severe. He was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to the harshest punishment short of death, full outlawry or scoginga. This meant that for a period of 3 years, he was declared a wolf in the sanctuary, a man outside the protection of all law. His property could be seized. He could not be given food or shelter. And any person in Iceland could kill him on sight, without any legal penalty. He had become a non-person. He had to vanish. For a man declared a full outlaw, there were 2 choices: to try and hide in the desolate, uninhabited highland of Iceland, living as a fugitive, or to take to the sea. Eric, a man of action, chose the sea, but he would not sail east, back to the civilized world where he was a known criminal. He would sail west into the vast, empty expanse of the North Atlantic, chasing a rumor. For decades, there had been sailors' tales of a vast landmass lying far to the west. A Norwegian mariner named Gunbjorn Olfsson, blown off course many years before, had sighted a string of rocky islands and the distant ice-capped mountains of great land beyond them. These were known as Gunbjorn Skerries. It was a ghost of a land, a place on the very edge of the imagination, and it was to this place that Eric decided to flee. The preparation for such a journey was a monumental task for an outlaw with limited resources. He had to secretly gather his few remaining loyal followers and his family. He had to ready his gnaw, a sturdy type of deep-sea cargo ship, broader and deeper than the warships used for raiding. He would have spent weeks preparing it. He would have meticulously checked every timber of the hull, recorking the seams with tarred animal hair to make them watertight. He would have mended his single, great square sail of thick woolen cloth. He would have loaded barrels of precious fresh water, and all the food they could carry, barrels of salted mutton and beef, racks of dried cod, and sacks of hard, dry bread. Finally, he would have loaded his livestock, a few shivering sheep, a cow, perhaps a goat, and all the tools and supplies they would need to start a new life if they survived the journey. The voyage itself would have been an ordeal of immense hardship. Imagine their small, open ship, a single speck on the vast, gray, heaving ocean. There was no shelter from the relentless wind and the freezing spray. They would have been perpetually cold and damp. They would have had to navigate the treacherous sea ice that drifted down from the Arctic. Their navigation was an art of approximation. They would have used the position of the sun on a clear day and the stars on a clear night, but the North Atlantic weather is notoriously cloudy. They would have watched the flight of seabirds and the patterns of the waves. It was a journey into profound uncertainty, driven by desperation. After days at sea, they finally sighted land. Eric had found Gunjoin's rumored country. For the next 3 years, the full term of his exile, he and his small band of followers were utterly alone, the only Europeans on a continent that was, to them, a new world. He didn't just hide. He methodically explored. He sailed down the forbidding eastern coast, a wall of rock and glacier, rounded the southern tip, and began to explore the western coast. And there, he found what he was looking for. Tucked away at the ends of deep, sheltered fjords, he found regions with green, grassy meadows, lands that, during the brief, intense Arctic summer, looked fertile and inviting. He found signs of previous inhabitants, the remains of stone tools and kayaks from the ancient Dorset culture, but the people themselves were gone. He was exploring a vast, silent, and empty land. He spent his 3 years of exile mapping it, learning its seasons, and choosing the best sites for future farms, often naming the most prominent landmarks after himself. In 985 AD, his 3-year sentence of outlawry expired. He was now free to return to Iceland. He sailed back, no longer a fugitive, but a man with a story, a man with a proposition. He had found a new world, and he needed to convince others to risk everything to follow him back to it. This was perhaps the greatest challenge of his life, and it revealed a new side to his character. Eric the Red, the brilliant and persuasive salesman. He knew he could not describe the land as it truly was, a marginal, subarctic country, 90% of which was covered by a permanent ice cap. He needed an appealing brand, and so he gave his discovery a masterful name. He called it Greenland. As the sagas dryly note, he reasoned that people would be much more tempted to go there if the land had an attractive name. He traveled around Iceland, a charismatic and compelling figure, telling tales not of the ice and the hardship, but of the wide-open green valleys, the rich pastures, and the endless fjords teeming with fish and seals. He was selling a dream of free land, of a new start, of a place where a man could be a chief in his own right, far from the feuds and social pressures of Iceland. His sales pitch was a stunning success. He managed to convince hundreds of Icelandic families, people hungry for land in a country where the best pastures were already taken, to join his colonizing venture. In the summer of 986 AD, a great fleet of 25 ships set out from western Iceland, bound for Greenland. It was a mass migration, the ships laden with families, livestock, tools, and hope. But the North Atlantic was as unforgiving as ever. A terrible storm struck the fleet during the crossing. Of the 25 ships that set out, only 14 made it to Greenland. The rest were either sunk by the storm or forced to turn back in defeat. Despite this tragic loss, the colonization was a success. Eric led the survivors to the areas he had scouted, and they established 2 main settlements. Eric himself built his own great farmstead at a place he named Bratley, meaning steep slope, in the most fertile part of the so-called Eastern Settlement. Hey, at last, the outlaw became the law. He was a founder and paramount chieftain of this new Norse society. He had finally found a land vast enough to contain his ambition and his temper. The man who had been cast out of 2 societies had succeeded in creating a third one in his own image. His life, a turbulent story of violence, feuds, and exile, had, through sheer stubbornness and a restless spirit, led him to become one of the great explorers of his age. He did not set out to discover a new world. He was simply running out of old ones to live in. And in doing so, he founded a lonely, resilient outpost of Norse Europe that would cling to life on the edge of the Arctic for nearly 500 years. Echoes in steel, the mystery of the Ulfbert swords. In the world of the Norseman, the sword was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of status, a repository of honor, and often the most valuable single object a man could ever hope to possess. A common farmer might go his entire life armed with only a simple wooden shield and a fire-hardened spear or a heavy iron axe, the same axe he used to fell trees. But for the warrior class, or the chieftains and their professional retainers, the sword was the ultimate expression of their identity. Swords were so prized that they were given names, passed down through generations as sacred family heirlooms, and even buried with their owners as a final, profound mark of respect. A typical Viking Age sword was a formidable weapon, a straight, double-edged blade usually about 3 feet long, with a simple crossguard and a heavy, 5-lobe pommel to provide balance. They were tools of war, designed for slashing and cutting in the brutal chaos of the shield wall. Archaeologists have unearthed thousands of them from graves and riverbeds across northern Europe. For a long time, they were seen as being broadly similar in quality, forged from the iron that could be smelted in the bloomeries of Scandinavia and northern Europe. This iron was imperfect. The smelting process, which involved heating iron or with charcoal in a clay furnace, produced a spongy mass of iron, or bloom, that was filled with impurities, most notably trapped pockets of slag, a glassy byproduct of the process. A Norse smith, a master of his craft, would take this raw bloom and begin the laborious process of forging it into a blade. He would heat it, hammer it, fold it over on itself, and hammer it again, repeating the process countless times. This technique, known as pattern welding, had 2 main purposes. It helped to work out some of the slag impurities, distributing the rest more evenly throughout the blade, and it created beautiful, watery patterns on the surface of the finished steel, a visual testament to the smith's skill. The resulting blade was strong, flexible, and could hold a decent edge. It was a fine and deadly weapon, a product of mature and sophisticated ironworking tradition. But for centuries, among the thousands of these typical swords found, archaeologists and curators had noticed a small and perplexing group of outliers. There were perhaps around 170 of them, all dating from a specific period, roughly from the 9th to the 11th centuries. In most respects, they looked like any other Viking sword, but they were different. They felt different. They were rumored to be lighter, stronger, and more flexible than their counterparts. And they all bore mysterious and distinctive marking inlaid into the blade in iron letters, plus VLF or plus T. For a long time, this inscription was assumed to be the name of a single, legendary master swordsmith, an almost mythical figure whose workshop produced weapons of unparalleled quality. These oath-boat swords, as they came to be known, were the most sought-after blades of their time, the super weapons of the Viking Age. They were so famous and so valuable that a whole host of lesser smiths produced cheaper, poorly-made knockoffs, with the oath-boat name often misspelled or clumsily rendered. But the secret of what made the true oath-boat sword so special remained locked within the steel itself. The mystery began to unravel only in the modern era, with the advent of advanced metallurgical analysis. When modern scientists took a true oath-boat sword and examined a cross-section of its blade under a powerful microscope, they found something astonishing, something that should not have been there. The steel was almost completely free of slag. It was clean, pure, and homogeneous. The carbon content, the element that turns soft iron into hard steel, was distributed with incredible uniformity throughout the blade. They realized they were not looking at typical European bloomery steel. They were looking at something far more advanced. They were looking at crucible steel. To understand the significance of this discovery, we must understand the difference in technology. Making bloomery steel is like making bread by hand, where you might have pockets of unmixed flour in the final loaf. Making crucible steel, on the other hand, is a far more sophisticated process. It involves placing iron and carbon-rich materials, such as charcoal, into a sealed clay pot or crucible. This crucible is then heated in a furnace to an extremely high temperature, well over 1,500 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, the iron melts completely, becoming a liquid. The carbon dissolves into the molten iron, distributing itself perfectly evenly, while the heavier slag impurities sink to the bottom. Once the crucible cools, what is left is a solid ingot of ultra-high carbon, perfectly homogeneous, slag-free steel. This technology was a quantum leap beyond the pattern welding of a European smith. It was a technology that was not supposed to exist in 9th century Europe. The furnaces required to reach such high temperatures were thought to have been invented many centuries later. The discovery was a genuine scientific anomaly, like finding a modern microprocessor inside an ancient Egyptian tomb. The question was no longer just who Ulfberht was, but a far more profound one. Where did this impossible steel come from? The answer, archaeologists now believe, did not lie in Viking Age Scandinavia at all. It lay thousands of miles to the east. The chemical signature of the Ulfberht blades, when analyzed, pointed not west, but east along the great river systems of what is now Russia and Ukraine. This was a path of the Volga trade route, the great eastern artery of the Viking world. While many Norsemen were raiding west into England and France, a significant number, known as the Russo-Varangians, were traveling east and south. Imagine a different kind of Viking journey. Not a sea voyage, but a river odyssey. A group of traders would set out from the Baltic Sea in their ships, sailing into the Gulf of Finland. From there, they would navigate the complex network of rivers, lakes, and portages, short overland sections where they had to physically carry their boats and cargo that led to the headwaters of the Great Volga River. Once on the Volga, they would begin a slow journey south that would last for months. These were not warriors seeking plunder, but merchants on a vast commercial enterprise. Their own cargo consisted of the treasures of the north, the thick, warm furs of beaver, sable, and fox, the fossilized tree resin known as amber from the Baltic shores, which was prized as a magical gemstone, honey and wax, and, most grimly, a steady supply of human beings captured in the Slavic hinterlands, sold as thralls in the great slave markets of the south. Their destination was the Caspian Sea and the lands beyond. They were heading toward the glittering, sophisticated, and immensely wealthy civilizations of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Persian Empire. It was here, in the bustling trade centers of the Islamic world, that they exchanged their northern goods for the treasures of the south. Their primary desire was for silver. They craved the beautiful, high-quality silver dirhams, the coins of the Caliphate, which they valued not as currency, but for their pure weight of precious metal. But they also traded for silks, spices, glass beads, and other exotic luxuries. And it appears that among these luxuries, there was one very special commodity, ingots of crucible steel. Archaeological evidence strongly suggests that the technology for making crucible steel was developed and perfected in Central Asia and the Middle East, perhaps as early as the 8th century. It was here, in places like modern-day Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, that smiths had mastered the high-temperature furnace technology needed to create the superior metal, which was highly prized for making the famous Damascus steel blades of the Islamic world. It seems that a small number of these incredibly valuable steel ingots made their way north, passed from merchant to merchant, until they ended up in the hands of the Norse traders on the Volga. A Varangian merchant would have paid a fortune for a single, unassuming-looking puck of this metal. It was a raw material that was almost magical in its purity. He would then transport it on the long, arduous journey back north, up the rivers, across the portages, and back to the Baltic. Eventually, this precious ingot would make its way to the workshop of a mastersmith somewhere in the Rhineland, the heartland of Frankish smithing, where the Ulfberht name seems to have originated as a kind of trademark for a very exclusive workshop or guild. When this ingot arrived, the Frankish or Norse smith would have recognized it as something extraordinary. But even with this superior material, the act of forging it into a sword was one of supreme skill. Crucible steel is very high in carbon, which makes it incredibly hard, but also potentially brittle if not handled correctly. The smith would have had to heat it to a precise temperature, judging its color in the dim light of his forge. He would have to hammer it with immense care, shaping the blade, drawing it out, and ensuring its internal structure remained sound. The final, critical stage was a quench, plunging the red-hot blade into water oil. This process had to be perfect. Too hot, and the blade could crack. Too cool, and it would not achieve its legendary hardness. To create an Ulfbert sword was a collaboration between a distant, unknown master of the crucible furnace and a European master of the forge. The Ulfbert sword, therefore, is far more than just a superior weapon. It is a powerful piece of evidence that shatters our old, simplistic view of the Viking Age. It reveals a world that was not isolated and brutish, but one that was deeply and surprisingly interconnected. It tells a story of a vast global trade network that stretched from the icy fjords of Norway down the river highways of Russia, all the way to the bustling workshops of Central Asia. The same Viking who might raid a monastery in Ireland for gold could also be trading peacefully for material whose technological origins lay thousands of miles away in a completely different civilization. The name plus VLEPA plus T, once thought to be a single smith, is now understood to be more like a modern brand name, a mark of unparalleled quality that was stamped onto these extraordinary blades for over 2 centuries. To own one was to own the absolute pinnacle of technology, a weapon forged from a mysterious, almost otherworldly material, a true echo of a distant world, hammered and shaped into a tool of war that was a terror and the envy of its age. A gilded cage, life in a Jarl's longhouse. We have walked the rocky fields of the common farmer and sailed the icy seas with an outlaw. We have felt the immense effort required simply to survive. But now, let us step through a different doorway, into a world of relative plenty, a world of power and influence. Let us enter the great hall, the skalli of a powerful Norwegian Jarl. This longhouse is not just a home. It is a political capital of the region, its courthouse, its feasting hall, its military barracks, and the engine of its economy. It is the center of gravity around which all the smaller farmsteads in the district orbit. And to live within its walls is to inhabit a gilded cage, a life of comfort and privilege held together by constant vigilance and immense responsibility. From the outside, the Jarl's longhouse looks like a much larger, more imposing version of the farmer's home. It is a great, ship-like structure, perhaps 30 meters long, with the same curved, whale-back roof of living turf. The walls are made of massive, upright timber staves, or intricately joined woodwork, a clear and public display of the owner's wealth in a land where large, straight timbers were a precious commodity. The doorway is wide, its posts deeply and elaborately carved with the intricate, endlessly looping knotwork pattern so beloved by Norse artists, intertwined beasts, serpents, and dragons that ride with controlled, dynamic energy. These carvings are not mere decoration. They are a statement of power and a magical ward, designed to protect the household from evil spirits. To step through this doorway is to be immediately enveloped by a wall of sensory information. The air inside is warm, almost hot, from the great central fire that burns day and night. But it is also incredibly thick with wood smoke. Unlike a common farmhouse with a single smoke hole, the Jarl's hole might have several, but they are never enough to clear the air completely. The smoke stings your eyes. It catches in the back of your throat. It has saturated everything within the hole, staining the great roof timbers a deep, glossy black, and lending its sharp, pungent aroma to every textile, every fur, and every person. This smoky haze is a permanent atmosphere of power, a constant, physical presence in the lives of the elite. The sounds are different, too. The silence and solitude of the small farmstead are gone. The great hall is a place of constant noise and activity. There is the crackle and roar of the central fire. There is a low murmur of conversation from the Jarl's personal retainers, his herd, a band of professional warriors who live and sleep in the hall. There is a clatter of pots from the cooking area, the rhythmic thump of a loom where a slave woman is weaving cloth, the barking of the Jarl's prize hunting dogs. It is a living, breathing space, filled with the hum of a large and complex household. But the most important person in this domestic world, the one who orchestrates this complex dance of daily life, is very often not the Jarl himself. A powerful chieftain was frequently absent. He might be away for weeks at the local thing, engaging in legal disputes. He might be away for months at a time, leading his men on a trading voyage or a raiding expedition. In his absence, the full and absolute authority for the entire state rested in the hands of his wife. She was a Husfreyja, the lady of the house, and she was not a passive figure. She was the acting CEO of a large and diverse agricultural corporation. Imagine the Husfreyja. She is a woman of high status, likely from another powerful family. Her marriage to the Jarl a strategic alliance designed to cement power. She is distinguished by her clothing. She wears a long linen shift, but over it, her gown is of fine, dyed wool, perhaps a rich blue or deep red, colors that required expensive imported dyes. Her clothes are adorned with embroidered patterns and held together by magnificent, ornate brooches of gilded bronze or silver, intricately cast in the shape of animals or geometric patterns. But the most important symbol of her power is not her jewelry. It is a set of keys that hangs from a chain at her waist. These are the keys to the lockable chest and, most importantly, to the pantry and the storehouse. In this world, where food was wealth, she literally held the key to the family's survival and prosperity. No one, not even her own husband, could access the food stores without her permission. Her day is not one of leisure. It is a long series of complex managerial tasks. She wakes at dawn and begins a mental accounting of the entire household. She is the quartermaster, the chief logistician. Her first duty is to portion out the day's food. She goes to the storehouse, a cool, dark building filled with barrels of salted meat and fish, sacks of grain, and wheels of hard cheese. She assesses the stocks, calculating how much can be used today while ensuring enough is preserved for the long months ahead. She then instructs the thralls and servant women on the day's meals. The cooking in a great hall is a constant process. A huge iron cauldron, suspended over the central fire, will be perpetually simmering, a stew of grains, vegetables, and whatever meat was available. Bread was baked not in an oven, but on flat stones or griddles placed directly in the hot embers of the fire. The Husfreyja oversees all of it, ensuring there is enough food for her large and hungry household, which might include dozens of family members, warriors, and slaves. She is also the head of domestic production. She manages the teams of women who spend their days at the loom. Wool from the estate's own sheep had to be cleaned, carded, and then spun into thread using a simple drop spindle, a task that occupied every spare moment. This thread was then woven into the broad bolts of the mall, the coarse woolen cloth that was a primary textile of their world. This cloth was a form of currency, a vital trade good, and the Husfreyja was responsible for its production, its quality control, and its storage. Her medical knowledge is essential. In a world without doctors, she is the primary healer. She cultivates a garden of medicinal herbs and knows their properties. She knows how to make a poultice for a warrior's wound, a soothing tea for a fever, or a salve for a burn. She is the midwife who presides over births, and she is the one who sits with the dying. She is the keeper of the household's health, her knowledge a vital bulwark against the constant threats of infection and disease. But her role is not purely domestic. She is a political figure in her own right. When guests arrive, another chieftain visiting to discuss an alliance, or a merchant with goods to trade, she presides over the feasting hall alongside her husband. She is a gracious host, ensuring the guests are well fed and that their drinking horns are kept full of ale or mead. But she is also observing, listening. She is a key advisor to her husband, her understanding of the local social and political landscape often sharper than his. Her opinion on a proposed marriage alliance, or her assessment of a rival's character, carries immense weight. This life, for all its material comfort, is lived under constant pressure. The Jarl's Longhouse is a public stage. The family's honor and reputation are always on display. A poorly managed household, a shortage of food, or failure in hospitality would bring immense shame upon the entire family. The Husfreyja lives with the knowledge that the fortunes of her clan rest heavily on her administrative skill, and there is the ever-present threat of violence. While the Great Hall is a place of relative safety, feuds could erupt with shocking suddenness. A drunken insult exchange during a feast could lead to drawn sword within the hall itself. The Hostfrager must be a skilled diplomat, able to de-escalate tensions and soothe the proud, quick tempers of the warriors who surround her. And when her husband is away at war, the defense of the undefended estate falls to her. She must be prepared to bar the doors and command the few remaining old men and young boys in a desperate defense against a rival surprise attack. So while her life is a world away from the grinding poverty of the struggling farmer, it is not a life of ease. The farmer fights a battle against the soil and the weather. The Hostfrager fights a battle of logistics, politics, and social pressure. Her cage may be gilded with fine clothes, silver brooches, and an abundance of food, but it is a cage nonetheless, one defined by the heavy weight of responsibility and the constant, vigilant effort required to maintain power in a dangerous and uncertain world. To be the lady of the house was to be the anchor of the Norse world, the still point around which the chaotic lives of warriors and chieftains turned. The floating miracle engineering the Viking longship. The story of the Viking Age is a story of the sea. The sea was their highway, their barrier, their source of sustenance, and their path to fortune. And the single greatest tool they possessed for mastering this dangerous, unpredictable world was their ship. The Viking longship was not just a boat. It was a physical embodiment of their culture's genius. It was a perfect fusion of form and function, a vessel so advanced in its design and so exquisitely adapted to its environment that it allowed a relatively small population from the cold, remote north to burst onto the world stage and change the course of European history. To see a longship is to see a paradox. It appears at once both incredibly graceful and brutally functional. It is long, narrow, and shallow, with a dramatic, elegantly curved prow and stern that rise from the water like the head and tail of a great sea serpent. These ships were flexible, light, and incredibly fast, able to move with equal efficiency under the power of either sail or oar. But their most revolutionary quality, the secret to their dominance, was their versatility. The same ship that could brave the terrifying, storm-tossed waves of the open North Atlantic could also, with its shallow draft, navigate far up the shallowest rivers of England, France, or Russia, allowing the Norsemen to strike deep into the heart of continents, hundreds of miles from the coast. It was an amphibious weapon, a tool that erased the boundary between sea and land. The creation of such a vessel was a long and complex process, guided by a deep, almost intuitive understanding of wood and water, a tradition of shipbuilding passed down not through written plans, but through generations of accumulated knowledge. It all began with the selection of a single tree. The heart of the longship was its keel. The keel is the backbone of any ship, the central timber that runs along its entire length. For a great longship, the smiths needed a single, massive oak tree, one that was perfectly straight and free of flaws. Finding such a tree was a challenge in itself. Once selected, the tree was felled, and then the master shipwright, the skipasme, would begin the painstaking process of shaping the keel. This was done not with saws, but with axes and adzes. Saws, the Norse knew, cut across the grain of the wood, weakening its structure. By shaping the keel with an axe, the shipwright followed the natural grain, preserving its inherent strength and flexibility. The keel of a longship was not a rigid beam. It was designed to flex and bend with the waves, to absorb the immense stresses of the open ocean. Once the keel was laid, the shipwrights would begin the process of building up the hull, and it is here that we find the true genius of Norse design. Viking ships were clinker-built, or lapstrake. This means that the planks of the hull, known as strakes, were not laid edge to edge to create a smooth surface. Instead, they were overlapped like shingles on a roof. Imagine the first plank, the garboard strake, being attached to the keel. The next plank up would be laid so that its lower edge overlapped the upper edge of the plank below it. This overlapping seam was then fastened together. The shipwright would drill a series underscore of holes through the overlapping planks and then drive iron rivets through from the outside. On the inside, a helper would place a small, square iron plate, or rove, over the end of the rivet, and the shipwright would hammer the end of the rivet flat, clamping the two planks together in a strong, permanent, and surprisingly watertight seal. This process was repeated, plank by plank, as the sides of the ship rose from the keel in a beautiful step pattern. This clinker construction created a hull that was immensely strong, yet remarkably light and flexible. It acted as a single, semi-rigid membrane, allowing the entire ship to twist and flex in heavy seas, absorbing and dissipating the energy of the waves rather than fighting against it. It was this inherent flexibility that made the longship so seaworthy. The planks themselves were another testament to their mastery of wood. They were not sawn from a log. They were created through a process of radial splitting. The shipwrights would take a large, straight-grained oak or pine log and, using wedges, split it into a series of pie-shaped sections. Each of these sections was then carefully shaped with an axe into a long, thin, yet incredibly strong plank. This method, like the shaping of the keel, ensured that the grain of the wood ran along the entire length of the plank, giving it a natural strength and resistance to splitting that sawn timber could never match. Inside the hull, the shipwrights would fit the ribs, but unlike in later shipbuilding traditions, the ribs of a longship were not rigidly attached to the planks. Instead, the ribs were lashed to the planks using tough, flexible cordage made from the roots of the spruce tree. The shipwright would carve small, raised cleats, or lugs, on the inner face of each plank. The ribs would be laid over these, and the spruce root lashings would be passed through holes in the cleats, securing the rib firmly but flexibly to the hull. This system allowed the hull to maintain its crucial ability to flex and move, further enhancing its seaworthiness. The final element, and the one that transformed the longship from a coastal vessel into a true ocean-going machine, was its sail. For much of their early history, Norse ships were primarily powered by oars. But by the beginning of the Viking Age, they had developed a large, single square sail, a powerful engine that allowed them to harness the wind. The creation of this sail was a massive undertaking in its own right, a task that fell to the women of the household. A single longship sail could be over 100 square meters in size and required an enormous amount of wool, perhaps from as many as 200 sheep. The wool had to be spun into yarn and then woven into a dense, heavy cloth on a large upright loom. To make the sail water-resistant and to help it hold its shape in the wind, it was coated with a mixture of animal fats, tallow, and fish oils. The resulting sail was heavy and durable, a powerful motor that, when the wind was right, could propel a longship at speeds of up to 15 knots, far faster than any other ship of its time. This sail, combined with the ship's long, narrow hull, made the longship a vessel of astonishing speed, enabling the hit-and-run raids for which the Vikings became so infamous. But a ship is only as good as the sailors who guide it. The Norsemen were master navigators who could find their way across vast, featureless stretches of open ocean. They did this without the aid of magnetic compasses, sextants, or modern charts. Their navigation was a sophisticated art form that combined keen observation with a few ingenious tools. Their primary guide was the sun. They had a deep, practical knowledge of the sun's path through the sky at different times of the year. They knew that at midday, the sun was due south, and they could use its height above the horizon to get a rough estimate of their latitude. But what about on cloudy days, so common in the North Atlantic? Here, legend and archaeology point to a remarkable tool, the sunstone. The sagas speak of sailors using a solar stein to find the sun's position even when it was hidden by clouds. For a long time, this was thought to be a myth. But modern research has shown that certain types of crystals, particularly calcite crystals found in Iceland, have a property called birefringence. When you look through one of these crystals at the sky, it polarizes the light, creating a pattern that changes based on the sun's position. By rotating the crystal until the pattern on both sides is equally bright, a navigator could pinpoint the location of the hidden sun with surprising accuracy. Another tool they likely used was a form of sun compass. An archaeological find in Greenland unearthed a fragment of a wooden disc with a central pin and carved lines. This device could be used in conjunction with the sun's shadow to maintain a steady course. At a known time of day, the navigator could align the disk based on the length of the shadow caused by the pin, and from that, establish the cardinal directions. Beyond these tools, they relied on a vast mental library of environmental knowledge. They understood the migration patterns of whales and the flight paths of seabirds, which could indicate the direction of land. They could read the color and temperature of the water and the patterns of the ocean swell. They would often carry caged ravens on their ships. If they were lost, they would release a raven. If the bird circled and returned to the ship, it meant there was no land in sight. If it flew off in a determined direction, the sailors would simply follow it, knowing it was heading for the nearest coast. This combination of a revolutionary vessel and sophisticated navigational skill is what made the Viking Age possible. The longship was more than wood, iron, and wool. It was a key that unlocked the world for the Norse people. It allowed them to trade, to raid, to explore, and to settle new land from North America to the Caspian Sea. It was a masterpiece of naval architecture, a floating miracle that was at once a beautiful work of art, a deadly weapon of war, and a vessel that carried a whole civilization into the pages of history. Silver, hacksilver, and thralls. The longships that journeyed out from the fjords of Scandinavia were not just vessels of war. They were the engines of dynamic and far-reaching economic system. The Viking Age was funded by a massive transfer of wealth, as the silver of established empires and the human capital of conquered lands flowed back towards the north. But the economy that this wealth fueled was fundamentally different from the one we know today. It was a world without cash, without banks, and without a centralized mint producing a standardized currency. The Viking economy was a bullion economy, a system where wealth was measured not by the face value of a coin, but by the pure, simple, and undeniable weight of precious metal. For the Norseman, the ultimate store of value was silver. While they certainly prized gold, it was far too rare to be used in everyday transactions. Silver was a metal of choice, durable, portable, and universally desired. When Vikings raided a monastery in England or Ireland, their primary targets were the silver objects of the church, chalices, plates, crucifixes, and reliquaries. When they traded their northern furs and amber in the great markets of the south, they demanded payment in silver coins, like the Arab dirhams from the Abbasid Caliphate or the pennies of Anglo-Saxon kings. But here is the crucial distinction. They did not value these coins for their stamp or for the kingly authority they represented. They valued them only for the silver they contained. An Arab dirham was not a dirham to a Viking. It was simply a conveniently pre-weighed, high-quality piece of silver. This attitude led to a unique and defining practice of their economic life, the creation and use of hack silver. Imagine a Viking chieftain returning from a successful raid. He has a bag filled with a motley collection of wealth, a silver arm ring taken from the body of a fallen enemy, a few Anglo-Saxon pennies, a beautifully decorated silver cup from a church, and a handful of Arab dirhams acquired through trade. To him, these are all just different shapes of the same thing. Silver. Now, imagine he need to pay one of his warriors for his service, or he want to buy a new cow from a neighboring farmer. The price is agreed upon not in coins, but in a specific weight of silver, perhaps 20 grams. How does he pay? He takes out his small, portable set of bronze balance scales. In one pan, he places a small lead or bronze weight of a known mass. Then, he takes the beautiful, ornate silver cup, a masterpiece of craftsmanship, places it on a hard surface, and with a sharp blow from his axe or a heavy knife, he unceremoniously chops a piece off it. He places his jagged piece of hack silver on the other pan of the scale. If it's too heavy, he might snip a smaller bit off with shears. If it's too light, he might add a bent fragment of a silver penny or a piece he chopped off an arm ring last week. He adjusts the amount, adding and subtracting fragments, until the scales balance perfectly. The transaction is incomplete. This practice can seem shocking to a modern observer. It appears destructive, almost barbaric, to so casually mutilate beautiful objects. But for the Norse, it was perfectly logical. The craftsmanship of the cup had an aesthetic value, to be sure, but its real transactional value lay purely in its material composition. An arm ring was not just a piece of jewelry. It was a wearable savings account, a portable store of bullion that could be literally hacked up as needed to conduct business. Archaeological hoards found across the Viking world are filled with this type of material. Thousands of chopped up coins, mangled brooches, and fragmented ingots, all mixed together, the content of a Viking's purse. This system, while functional, relied on trust and constant verification. Every merchant, every significant trader, carried their own set of scales and weights. Every transaction was a negotiation, followed by a careful public weighing. It was a slow, deliberate, and tangible form of commerce, a world away from the abstract, instantaneous transactions of today. This flow of silver fueled a new level of social stratification in the Norse homelands. It allowed successful jarls to pay for the loyalty of their herd, their professional war bands. They could fund the construction of larger ships and grander halls. Wealth, increasingly concentrated in the hands of the most successful raiders and traders, began to disrupt the old, more egalitarian social order of the independent farmer. Silver became a new and powerful tool for projecting power. But there was another, much darker commodity that was just as vital to the Viking economy, a source of wealth measured not in grams of silver, but in human lives. This was the economy of the thrall. Thralls were the lowest class in Norse society. They were slaves. Like the concept of slavery in the Aztec world, it was a legal status, but one with its own brutal Nordic character. Thralls were, in essence, property. They could be bought and sold, inherited, given as gifts, or used to pay a debt. They had virtually no legal rights. They could not own significant property. They could not testify in a court of law. And if a thrall was killed, the legal penalty was not a charge of murder, but simply the payment of a fine to the thrall's owner for the destruction of his property. How did a person become a thrall? There were several paths. The most common was capture in war. When Vikings raided a coastline in Ireland, Scotland, or the Slavic lands, they were not only seeking portable wealth, they were seeking people. The men, women, and children captured in these raids were a primary form of plunder. They would be bound and loaded onto the longships along with the silver and other goods. For these captives, the experience would have been one of utter terror. They were torn from their homes, separated from their families, and transported to a strange and distant land where they did not speak the language and were considered little more than livestock. Another path to thraldom was through debt. In a bad year, a struggling farmer might have no choice but to sell one of his own children into servitude to feed the rest of his family. A person could also be born into slavery. If a thrall had a child, that child was automatically a thrall, belonging to their parents' owner. The life of a thrall was one of unrelenting labor. They did the hardest, most monotonous, and most dangerous work on a Norse farmstead. Male thralls would be tasked with the back-breaking labor of clearing new fields, cutting down trees, quarrying stone, and burning charcoal. They were the ones who had to dig the ditches and build the turf walls. They were often responsible for the doughtiest tasks, like mucking out the animal pens and spreading manure on the fields. Female thralls had their own domain of endless toil. They spent their days grinding grain on the heavy rotary querns, a physically exhausting task that could occupy hours every single day. They were responsible for the cooking, the cleaning, the milking of the cows and goats, and the laborious process of making butter and cheese. A significant portion of their time was spent in textile production, carding wool, spinning it into yarn, and weaving it into cloth on the great looms. They were also subject to the absolute sexual authority of their owner. The sagas are clear that the male head of a household had unrestricted sexual access to his female slaves, and any children born from such unions were also the property of the master. The thralls were a vital part of the household economy. They were the labor force that allowed the farm to function, freeing up the Carl and his family to focus on other tasks. On a larger scale, they were a major export commodity. The Great Volga trade route, which brought crucible steel and silver from the east, was powered in large part by the export of European thralls to the slave markets of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire. The Islamic and Byzantine world had a voracious appetite for slaves, for servants, soldiers, and laborers, and the Rus traders of the east were the primary suppliers. The silver dirhams that flowed into Scandinavia were, in many cases, paid for with the lives and freedom of countless unnamed captives from across Europe. For a thrall, life was bleak, but perhaps not entirely without hope. The Norse system did allow for a slave to be freed, a process called manumission. An owner could choose to free a loyal thrall as a reward for long service. In some cases, a thrall might be allowed to work for themselves in their spare time and slowly, painstakingly, accumulate enough wealth to purchase their own freedom. A freedman, or leisingi, occupied a precarious middle ground in society. They were no longer property, but they were not fully free either. They still owed a degree of loyalty and obligation to their former master. True freedom often took another generation. The children of a freedman were finally considered full members of the free class, the Karls. The economy of the Viking Age, therefore, was a complex and often brutal mixture of pastoral farming, long-distance trade, and violent predation. It was a system that ran on two parallel tracks, the gleaming, abstract value of weighted silver, and the grim, tangible value of human labor. The beautiful silver arm rings and the intricate Arab coins that we find in Viking hoards are only one side of the ledger. The other side, the side that is invisible in the archaeological record, is the story of the thrall, the captive Irish girl forced to grind grain in a smoky longhouse, the Slavic boy sold in a market on the Volga. The great wealth that funded the Viking Age was built as much on their stolen lives and endless labor as it was on the shimmering weight of silver. Judgment at the thing. In a society as proud, independent, and notoriously quick-tempered as that of the Viking Age, the potential for conflict was ever present. A dispute over the boundary of a farm, an accusation of theft, a drunken insult at a feast, or the killing of a kinsman. Any of these could easily spiral into a devastating cycle of violence, a blood feud that could tear a community apart for generations. The Norse world, however, was not a lawless anarchy. It was governed by a sophisticated and deeply ingrained legal system, one that operated not in stone courthouses presided over by bewigged judges, but in the open air at a communal assembly known as a thing. The thing was the bedrock of Norse political and social life. It was a regular gathering of all the free men of a particular region, be it a small district or an entire nation, who came together to make laws, to settle disputes, and to witness justice. It was a profoundly democratic institution for its time. Every Carl, every free farmer, had not only the right but the duty to attend. To participate in the thing was a fundamental definition of a free man's status. It was here that a man had a voice. It was here that he was judged by his peers. And it was here that the unwritten rules of their society were made real. Imagine the scene of a local thing, held perhaps twice a year at a traditional, sacred site in the landscape, a prominent hill, a large boulder, or a grove of ancient trees. 4 days beforehand, farmers and their families would travel from their isolated homesteads, journeying on foot or by boat. The meeting of the thing was a major social event, a chance to see distant relatives, to arrange marriages, to trade goods, and to catch up on the news of the district. The site would transform into a temporary village, a bustling encampment of tents and makeshift shelters. On the appointed day, the formal proceedings would begin. The assembly would gather around the focal point of the site, often a small, consecrated hill known as the Lorok or Logbog. At the beginning of the session, the assembly would be sanctified. A chieftain or priest would perform a ritual, perhaps the sacrificing of an animal, to bless the proceedings and to call upon the gods, particularly the god Tiwaya, the one-handed deity associated with law and justice, to bear witness. This act established the thing as a sacred space, a place where all men were bound by solemn oaths. The central figure at the thing was the law speaker. The law speaker was not a king or a judge who made unilateral decisions. He was a man, elected by the assembly and respected for his wisdom, his impartiality, and, most importantly, his prodigious memory. In a society where the law was not written down in a comprehensive legal code, the law speaker was a living repository of the entire body of ancestral laws and customs. One of his primary duties at each session of the thing was to recite a portion of the law from memory, standing on the law rock so all could hear. Over the course of his tenure, he would recite the entire law code, ensuring that this vital cultural knowledge was never lost and was passed down, orally, from one generation to the next. With the law recited and the assembly consecrated, the business of settling disputes would begin. If you, as a farmer, had a grievance against a neighbor, if you believed his cattle had damaged your hayfield, for instance, you would bring your case before the thing. You would stand before the assembly and state your accusation clearly and formally, following specific, traditional verbal formulas. Your neighbor would then stand and give his response. There were no lawyers. Each man pleaded his own case. The verdict was not decided by a single judge, but by a panel or jury of local chieftains and respective farmers. They would listen to the arguments. They would hear testimony from any witnesses who were brought forward. Oaths were incredibly important. A witness would have to swear a solemn oath on a sacred object, often a silver ring consecrated to the gods, that their testimony was true. In this world, where man's honor and reputation were his most valuable possessions, to swear a false oath was a crime of immense gravity, one that would bring not only legal penalty but divine retribution and social ruin. Once all the evidence was heard, the panel would deliver its verdict. For a minor offense like the damaged hayfield, the judgment would almost certainly be a fine, a payment of restitution to the injured party. But what about more serious crimes, like theft or murder? The Norse legal system placed immense emphasis on avoiding the destructive cycle of the blood feud. While vengeance was an accepted part of their culture, the law sought to channel it, to transform it from an act of violence into a financial transaction. The cornerstone of this system was the concept of wergild, or man price. Every person in Norse society, from the highest jarl to the lowliest freedman, had a specific monetary value assigned to them based on their social rank. If a person was killed, the killer and his family were legally obligated to pay the wergild of the victim to the victim's family. This was not seen as a simple fine. It was a formal, legally mandated blood money, an immense payment designed to compensate the bereaved family for their loss and, most importantly, to satisfy their honor, making a retaliatory revenge killing unnecessary. The payment of wergild was a way to formally end the feud before it could begin. The amounts were staggering. The wergild for a high-ranking chieftain could be a fortune in silver and livestock, enough to financially ruin the killer's family. This system created a powerful incentive for social control. The actions of an individual had consequences for their entire kin group, so families had a vested interest in keeping their more hot-tempered members in check. If a defendant could not pay the wergild, or if the crime was so heinous that it was deemed unnatable, the thing could declare the guilty party an outlaw. As we saw with Eric the Red, this was a terrifying fate. A lesser outlawry might mean banishment for a set number of years. But for the worst crimes, the sentence was full outlawry, turning the person into a legal nonentity who could be hunted and killed with impunity. It was, in effect, a death sentence outsourced to the entire community. But what happened when a case was not clue-cut? What if there were no witnesses, and it was simply one man's word against another's? In these situations, the Norse legal system sometimes turned to a different kind of judgment, the trial by ordeal. This was a direct appeal to the gods to reveal the truth. An accused person might be forced to undergo the holmgang or island going. This was a ritualized duel, fought on a small island or marked off cloak on the ground, according to a strict set of rules. The outcome of a duel was not seen as a test of strength, but as a judgment from the god of war, Odin. It was believed the gods would grant victory to the man who was in the right. Another form of ordeal was a trial by hot iron. An accused person might be forced to carry a red-hot piece of iron for a set number of paces. Their hand would then be bandaged and sealed. After 3 days, the bandage would be removed. If the wound was clean and healing, they were judged innocent. If it was festering and infected, they were declared guilty. The state of a wound seen as a direct sign of divine judgment. The most famous and powerful of all the things was the Althing in Iceland. Established in 930 AD, it was a national assembly for the entire country. Every summer, for 2 weeks, Icelanders from every corner of the island would converge on a dramatic Rift Valley landscape called Ingvella, or Thing Fields. Here, surrounded by cliffs of black volcanic rock, they conducted the nation's business. It was at the Althing that major national decisions were made, that Christianity was peacefully adopted as a national religion, and where the great Icelandic sagas would later be recited. The Althing of Iceland is a powerful testament to the Norse belief in law and assembly, and it is recognized today as the oldest surviving parliament in the world. The Viking legal system was, therefore, a complex interplay of democratic participation, legal tradition, and religious belief. It was a system that placed a community at the very center of justice. It sought not just to punish the guilty, but to maintain the delicate social harmony upon which their survival depended. The Thing was more than a court. It was a mechanism that allowed a society of fierce and proud individualists to function as a coherent whole, a place where the rule of law was not imposed from above by a king, but was affirmed, recited, and enforced by the collective will of the free people themselves. Whispers of Yggdrasil. The laws of the Thing provided a framework for social order, a way for men to live together. But this earthly order was merely a reflection of a much grander, more complex, and more mysterious order, the structure of the cosmos itself. The Norse people did not see the world as a single, simple plane of existence. Their universe was a multi-layered, interconnected reality, a great and wondrous tree of worlds, pulsing with magic, inhabited by a host of powerful beings, and overshadowed by the ever-present, unchangeable will of fate. At the very center of everything was Yggdrasil, the world tree. It was an immense, eternal ash tree of unimaginable scale. Its great roots burrowed deep into the fabric of reality, and its highest branches were said to scrape the roof of the sky, their leaves brushing against the stars. Yggdrasil was not just a feature in the universe. It was the universe. It was a great axis, the pillar that supported and connected all of existence. Within its roots and branches were nested the 9 worlds, the distinct but interwoven realms of gods, giants, elves, and men. Our own world, the world of humanity, was known as Midgard, the Middle Enclosure. It was a familiar realm of mountains and fjords, of forests and fields. But Midgard was not alone. It was surrounded by a great, impassable ocean, and encircling that ocean was a terrifying wilderness known as Jotunheim, the land of the giants. The giants, or Jotnar, were ancient, chaotic, and powerful beings, the sworn enemies of the gods. They were forces of nature, of destructive frost, crushing ice, and shattering rock. The constant struggle between the gods and the giants was a primary dynamic of Norse mythology, a cosmic war between order and chaos. Above Midgard, connected by a shimmering, ephemeral rainbow bridge called the Bifrost, lay Asgard, the home of the warrior gods, the Aesir. This was a celestial fortress of golden halls and high towers, the divine realm from which the gods watched over the world of men. Also among the heavens was Vanaheim, the home of the Vani, a second family of gods associated with fertility, prosperity, and magic. And there was Alfheim, the luminous home of the light elves, beautiful and mysterious beings who were often seen as lesser deities. Below Midgard, the geography of the cosmos grew darker. There was Svartalfheim, the world of the dark elves, a subterranean realm inhabited by master craftsmen, the dwarfs, who were said to forge the magical treasures of the gods in their underground smithies. There was Niflheim, a primordial world of ice, mist, and eternal cold. And finally, there was a grim realm of hell, the underworld. Hell was not a place of fiery punishment like the Christian hell. It was a cold, gray, and shadowy kingdom, ruled over by a goddess of the same name, a being whose face was half that of a beautiful woman and half that of a decaying corpse. Hell was a final destination for the vast majority of people who died of old age or sickness, a dim, joyless, but not necessarily torturous existence. This complex, multi-layered cosmos was populated by a pantheon of powerful and deeply human gods. These were not distant, perfect, or omnipotent deities. The Norse gods were flawed. They could be vain, deceitful, quick to anger, and were themselves subject to the great power of fate. This made them relatable figures, gods a farmer could understand. The chief of the Easy, the Old Father, was Odin. Odin was a complex and often frightening god. He was not a benevolent father figure. He was a god of war, but not of righteous battle. He was a god of the battle fury, of the berserker's rage, and of the cunning strategy that led to victory. He was also the god of wisdom, poetry, and magic. But his wisdom was not freely given. It was purchased at a great and terrible price. In his relentless quest for knowledge, he sacrificed one of his own eyes, casting it into the well of Mimi, the well of wisdom, in exchange for a single drink. He also hung himself from a branch of Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, in a symbolic death and rebirth that allowed him to discover the secrets of the runes. The runes were more than just an alphabet. Each runic letter had a name, a phonetic sound, and a specific magical and conceptual power. To carve a rune was not just a rite, but to invoke the power inherent in that symbol. Runes were used for practical inscriptions on memorial stones, but they were also used in magic, for healing, for protection, for cursing an enemy, or for trying to divine the future. Odin was a master of this runic magic, a shaman king who wandered the 9 worlds in disguise, always seeking more knowledge. The most popular and widely worshipped god, especially among the common farmers and warriors, was Odin's son, Thor. Thor was the opposite of his father. Where Odin was subtle, intellectual, and morally ambiguous, Thor was straightforward, honest, and immensely strong. He was a champion of mankind, the great protector of Midgard. He was the god of thunder, and the sound of a thunderstorm was believed to be the rumbling of his goat-drawn chariot across the sky. His weapon was a mighty hammer, Mjolnir, a magical weapon forged by the dwarfs that could shatter mountains and would always return to his hand when thrown. Thor was a comforting and reassuring figure, a divine warrior who could be relied upon to defend the world of men from the ever-present threat of the frost giants. A Norse farmer might pray to Odin for strategic success in a feud, but he would pray to Thor for the strength to complete his daily labor and for protection from the chaotic forces of the world. A third major deity was Freyja, who, along with her twin brother Freya, was one of the Varnic gods who came to live in Asgard. Freyja was the goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and desire. A farmer's wife might leave her an offering in the hopes of a safe childbirth or a fertile herd of cattle. But Freyja was no simple earth mother. She was also a powerful and warlike goddess. She was a master of a form of magic called Siv, a shamanistic practice of seeing into the future. And, most importantly, she was a chooser of the slain. It was believed that of all the warriors who died bravely in battle, Freyja had the right to choose the first half to come and live with her in her great hall in Asgard. The other half went to Odin's hall, Valhalla. The concept of the afterlife was directly tied to the manner of one's death. A straw death, a death of old age or sickness in one's bed, led to the gloomy realm of hell. But a glorious death in battle, a sword death, offered a much more appealing fate. To be chosen by Freyja or by Odin's Valkyries was the highest honor a warrior could achieve. To feast and fight in the halls of Valhalla until the end of time was the ultimate reward for a life of courage. But underlying this entire system, the great tree, the 9 worlds, the struggles of the gods themselves, was a final, supreme, and inescapable power, the power of WRD, or fate. The Norse did not believe in free will in the modern sense. They believed that the ultimate destiny of every god and every person was predetermined, spun out at the moment of their birth by three mysterious female figures known as the Norns, who live at the base of Yggdrasil. The Norns wove the tapestry of fate, and not even Odin himself could alter the threads they had spun. This belief did not lead to passivity. On the contrary, it fostered a specific kind of courageous fatalism. If your destiny was already written, then there was no point in fearing it. The only thing you could control was how you met your fate. A man's worth was measured by his courage in the face of his unchangeable destiny. To know that you might be fated to die in a particular battle did not mean you should run from it. It meant you should charge into it with all the more fury, to meet your end bravely, and so win lasting fame and a place in sagas. Your reputation, the story that will be told about you after you were gone, was the only form of immortality you could truly control. This belief in an ultimate, unavoidable destiny culminated in the myth of Ragnarok, the doom of the gods. The Norse believed that their world, the fifth sun, would end in a final, apocalyptic battle. It would be preceded by terrible signs. 3 years of unending winter, the sun and moon being swallowed by celestial wolves, and the bonds that held the forces of chaos in check finally breaking. The great trickster god, Loki, would lead the giants and the monsters of the underworld in an all-out assault on Asgard. Odin would lead the gods and the host of slain warriors from Valhalla in a final, hopeless battle. It was a battle they knew they were fated to lose. Thor would kill the great world serpent, but would then die from its venom. Odin would be devoured by the monstrous wolf Fenrir. The world would be consumed by fire and flood. But the story did not end in absolute oblivion. After the destruction, a new, green world was prophesied to emerge from the sea. A handful of the younger, gentler gods would survive, and a single human man and woman, who had hidden within the trunk of Yggdrasil itself, would emerge to repopulate the earth. The cosmology of the Norse people was thus a cycle of creation, struggle, destruction, and rebirth. It was a worldview that mirrored the harsh realities of their own lives. It acknowledged the beauty and order of the world, but also its inherent violence and the certainty of its end. It was a belief system that did not offer easy answers or the promise of eternal paradise, but instead demanded courage, resilience, and an unwavering acceptance of one's own fate. The burden of the shield wall. The sagas and poems are filled with the glorious deeds of warriors. They sing of heroic charges, of single combat against impossible odds, of the glorious death that leads to the feasting halls of Valhalla. But these are the highlights, the polished and poetic moments of a much harsher and more grueling reality. For the average Norse warrior, life on campaign was not a story of constant glory. It was a long and arduous ordeal, a life of mind-numbing labor, of gnawing hunger, of constant discomfort, and of sheer, terrifying exhaustion. The battle itself, the moment of high-octane violence, was often just a brief, chaotic climax to weeks or even months of relentless, grinding hardship. Let us imagine a warrior called to service by his jarl. He is not a professional soldier in the modern sense, but a farmer, a carl, who owns his own land and has his own family. He is obligated by the bonds of loyalty and law to answer his chieftain's call. The first task is to gather his equipment, his Hercule or war gear. This is not provided by the state. Each warrior is responsible for outfitting himself. For a common warrior, this gear is simple and functional. His primary protection is his shield. The Viking shield is a large, round disc of wood, typically made of light but strong linden planks. In the center is a dome-shaped iron boss, which protects his hand. His hand grips a single wooden bar on the back of the shield, directly behind the boss. The shield is his most vital piece of equipment, his portable wall. It is his defense against arrows, spears, and the slashing cuts of an enemy's sword or axe. His clothing is the same woolen tunic and trousers he wears on his farm, perhaps with a heavy leather cloak for warmth. He has no metal armor. Mail coats, or burnies, made of thousands of interlinked iron rings, were astonishingly expensive and time-consuming to produce. They were the exclusive preserve of the Jarl and his wealthiest retainers. The average warrior might wear a thick leather jerkin, perhaps hardened by being boiled in wax, which offered some protection against a cutting blow, but would do little to stop a determined spear thrust. On his head, he might wear a simple helmet of hardened leather, or, if he was more fortunate, a conical iron helmet with prominent nose guard, known as a spangen helm. The iconic image of the horned Viking helmet is a complete myth, a romantic invention of the 19th century. Such a helmet would have been hopelessly impractical in the press of a shield wall, the horn serving only to be caught by an enemy's weapon. His weapons are also practical. His primary weapon is a spear. The Viking spear was a versatile tool, with a long wooden shaft of ash and a leaf-shaped iron head. It could be thrown as a javelin at a distance, or used as a thrusting weapon in close-quarters combat. Alongside his spear, he would carry a heavy sidearm. For most warriors, this was not a sword, which was a high-status and expensive weapon, but a heavy, single-bladed axe. The Viking axe, with its distinctive bearded blade that hooked downwards, was a terrifyingly effective weapon. It was a great can-opener of its day, capable of splitting a shield, crushing a helmet, or cleaving through a limb with a single, powerful blow. With his gear assembled, the campaign begins, and the first, and often largest, part of any campaign is the march. A warrior's life was one of endless walking. Imagine the scene, a long, snaking column of hundreds of men, marching for days on end through dense forest or across bog and moorland. Each man carries his own equipment. The shield, slung over his back, is heavy and awkward. His spear is a constant encumbrance. He carries a bedroll, a water skin, a small cooking pot, and his meager rations in a leather sack. The combined weight is a constant, wearying burden on his shoulders and back. The march is monotonous, a steady rhythm of boots on date, the clink of metal, the creak of leather. The food on campaign is poor and scarce. Each man carries a small supply of dried fish and hard, flat bread, but this runs out quickly. The army must live off the land. This means foraging for nuts and berries, or hunting for small game. But a large group of noisy, marching men is not an effective hunting party. More often, survival depends on what can be taken from the land they are marching through. If they are in friendly territory, they might be supplied by allied farms. If they are in enemy territory, they forage by raiding, taking what they need from the undefended farmsteads of their enemies. But this is an unreliable source of supply. Hunger is a constant companion, a dull ache in the belly that saps a man's strength and morale. Each night, the army must make camp. This is not a time for rest, but another laborious task. Sentries must be posted to guard against a surprise attack. Firewood must be gathered. A simple meal must be cooked over a small fire. But the greatest labor of a legionary in the Roman army, the construction of a fortified camp each night, was not standard practice for the Vikings. Their camps were often simple, temporary affairs, offering little protection beyond the vigilance of their sentries. The warrior must also spend a portion of every evening maintaining his gear. His life depends on it. He must check the leather straps on his shield. He must sharpen the edge of his axe with a whetstone. He must ensure his spearhead is secure on its shaft. He must mend any tears in his leather shoes or his woolen cloak. This constant maintenance is a vital, if tedious, part of the routine. A broken shield strap or a dull axe in the heat of battle could be a fatal oversight. After days or weeks of this grueling routine, the time for battle finally arrives. The two armies draw up on a chosen field. The moments before the battle are filled with a tense, terrifying anticipation. The warrior stands in his designated place in the line, shoulder to shoulder with his comrades. He can hear the enemy army across the field, the shouts of their chieftains, the sounds of their own war horns. He tightens his grip on his spear, his knuckles white, his heart pounds in his chest. This is the moment all the marching and all the hunger has been leading up to. The primary tactic of Viking Age warfare was the shield wall, or skjoldborg. The warriors would stand in a tightly packed formation, several ranks deep. The men in the front rank would lock their shields together, their edges overlapping, to create a solid, living wall of wood and iron. From behind this wall, the men in the second rank would thrust their long spears over the heads and shoulders of their comrades. It was a defensive formation designed to withstand an initial charge and to present an unbroken front to the enemy. The battle begins with an exchange of missiles. Both sides hurl a volley of spears, darts, and arrows. The air is thick with whirring shafts. The warrior huddles behind his shield, hearing the heavy thump of projectiles embedding themselves in the wood just inches from his face. This initial phase is a test of nerve, designed to break the enemy's cohesion before the lines even meet. Then comes the charge. With a great roar, the two shield walls advance on each other across the field. The final few yards are a frantic rush, and then the two walls collide with a thunderous crash of wood on wood, of iron on iron. The moment of impact is a brutal, physical shock. The sheer weight and pressure of the enemy line threatens to crush him. He must brace himself, planting his feet, using all his strength to hold his place in the wall. The battle now becomes a grim, shoving, pushing match. The goal is to break the enemy's shield wall, to create a gap that can be exploited. It is a contest of pure, brute strength and endurance. The fighting is claustrophobic and terrifyingly intimate. You are so close to the enemy you can smell his sweat and hear his ragged breathing. The space is filled with the desperate sounds of battle, the splintering of shields, the clang of axe on helmet, the screams of the wounded, and the guttural war cries of the fighters. From behind the relative safety of the shield wall, the warrior jabs with his spear, looking for any small opening, a gap between shields, an exposed leg or arm. If his spear breaks, he draws his axe and joins the brutal, close quarters hacking at the enemy line. The fighting is exhausting. His shield arm aches with the strain of holding his shield up. His weapon arm grows heavy. His lungs burn. He is fighting for his life in a maelstrom of controlled, disciplined violence. To be wounded is a constant terror. A deep cut from an axe could be a death sentence, not from the initial wound, but from the infection that would inevitably set in days later. Medical knowledge is rudimentary. A wound would be washed with water, perhaps packed with moss, and bandaged, but in a world without antibiotics, even a minor wound could prove fatal. The battle might last for hours, a relentless, grinding struggle of attrition. Eventually, one side will begin to falter. A section of their shield wall will buckle and break. The opposing army will pour into the gap, and the orderly formation will dissolve into a chaotic rout. This is the most dangerous moment of the battle. It is now a desperate fight for individual survival as the victors hunt down the fleeing losers. To survive a battle is to be utterly and completely spent, physically and emotionally. The warrior is caked in sweat, mud, and blood. His muscles tremble with exhaustion, but the work is not over. The dead must be attended to, the wounded gathered. The field must be scavenged for unbroken weapons and any valuables that can be recovered. There is no time for rest. The campaign continues. The army must march on. The life of the Viking warrior, stripped of its poetic glory, was one of profound hardship. It was a life of endless labor, of discomfort, of hunger, and of moments of unimaginable terror and violence. The sagas remember the names of the great jarls and the heroes who won fame through their deeds. But the shield wall, the foundation of their military success, was built from the anonymous courage and endurance of thousands of ordinary men, farmers, and freeholders who answered the call of their chieftain and stoically shouldered the terrible burden of war. The end of an era. The Viking Age, a period of explosive energy that had reshaped the map of Europe, could not last forever. An era defined by the outward expansion of small, independent warbands, loyal only to their local chieftain, was destined to be transformed by the very forces it helped to set in motion. There was no single event that marked its end. There was no final battle where the last longship sailed into sunset. Instead, the Viking Age concluded through a slow, complex process of evolution and assimilation. The Viking did not vanish. He changed. He settled down. He adopted new faiths and new ways of life. And in doing so, the very conditions that had created the age of the raiders slowly dissolved into the fabric of a new, emerging medieval Europe. One of the most powerful forces of this change came not from without, but from within Scandinavia itself. The wealth that flowed back from the raids and trade, the immense hoards of silver, had a profound and destabilizing effect on the old social order. This new wealth allowed the most powerful and ambitious chieftains to consolidate their power on a scale never before seen. They could afford to maintain larger and more permanent armies, to build fortifications, and to reward loyalty with land and silver, creating a more feudal-style system of governance. Slowly, over the 10th and 11th centuries, these great chieftains began to think of themselves not just as jarls, but as kings. Figures like Harald Bluetooth in Denmark and Harald Fairhair in Norway began to subdue their rivals, forcing the lesser chieftains to submit to their authority. They sought to create unified, centralized kingdoms, modeled on the powerful monarchies they had encountered in England and Francia. This process was long and often bloody, but its effect was profound. A centralized kingdom required professional army loyal to the king, not a patchwork of private warbands loyal to local jarls. It required a system of national taxation, replacing the ad hoc economy of plunder. In short, the rise of powerful Scandinavian kings curtailed the freedom of the independent chieftains who were the engine of the Viking Age. The act of going Viking, once a legitimate and honorable path to wealth and fame, began to be seen by these new kings as a form of piracy, a disruptive force that undermined their own royal authority. This political consolidation went hand in hand with a profound spiritual and cultural transformation, the conversion to Christianity. The process was slow and complex. For a long time, the two faiths coexisted. It was not uncommon for a Viking chieftain to hedge his bets, wearing a Thor's hammer amulet alongside a Christian cross. But the new religion had powerful advantages. It was a religion of the most successful and sophisticated kingdoms in Europe. To adopt Christianity was to be seen as a modern, legitimate ruler, making it easier to forge diplomatic and trade relationships with the powerful Christian kingdoms to the south. Christian missionaries, often backed by the authority of these newly powerful Scandinavian kings, traveled throughout the north preaching the new faith. They built churches, established bishoprics, and slowly replaced the old pagan rituals with Christian ones. The conversion was a top-down process. Once a king or a powerful jarl converted, his subjects were generally expected to follow suit. This shift had a massive cultural impact. The Christian church brought with it the art of writing in the Latin script, which eventually replaced the use of runes for most purposes. It brought with it a different moral framework, one that condemned practices like infanticide and the taking of thralls. And, most importantly, it offered a different worldview. The old Norse cosmos, with its cyclical nature and its inevitable violent end at Ragnarok, was replaced by the linear Christian narrative of creation, sin, and salvation. The promise of an eternal heavenly reward for a life of faith began to supplant the warrior's dream of a glorious death leading to Valhalla. The final factor in the winding down of the Viking Age was assimilation. The Norsemen were remarkably adaptable. The same warrior who burned a monastery in one generation might, in the next, settle down on the conquered land, marry a local woman, adopt a local language and customs, and become a Christian farmer. We see this most clearly in the great territories they conquered and settled. In northern France, the Viking chieftain Rollo and his followers were granted a vast territory by the Frankish king in 911 AD. This land became known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. Within a few generations, these fierce Viking warriors had completely transformed. They adopted the French language, the Christian religion, and the Frankish system of feudalism. They became the Normans, some of the most formidable knights and administrators in all of Europe. And just a century and a half later, in 1066, their descendant, William the Conqueror, would launch his own invasion across the sea, conquering England and forever changing the course of its history. The raiders had become kings. A similar process occurred in England. The large swaths of eastern England that were conquered and settled by the Vikings became known as the Danelaw. Here, Norse settlers mingled with the native Anglo-Saxons, and the two cultures began to merge. They traded, they intermarried, and they influenced each other profoundly. The English language itself is a testament to this fusion, filled with hundreds of core words that have their roots in Old Norse. Words like sky, skin, leg, window, husband, and even the pronouns a, them, and their. In the east, the Swedish Vikings, the Russ, who had traveled down the great rivers to trade, also began to settle. They established fortified towns like Kiev and became the ruling military elite over the vast Slavic population. Over time, they too assimilated, adopting the Slavic language and, eventually, the Eastern Orthodox Christian faith. They laid the foundation for what will become the great state of Kievan Rus, the ancestor of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. As the 11th century drew to a close, the world had changed. The kingdoms of Europe were more organized and better defended. The old, easy targets for raids were gone. The Scandinavian homeland themselves were now unified, Christian kingdoms, part of the European mainstream. The Norse people had not been defeated. They had succeeded so completely that they had rendered their old way of life obsolete. They had integrated themselves into the very fabric of the societies they had once terrorized. The age of the roving longship had passed, and the age of the settled, Christian, European kingdom had fully dawned. Our journey through the world of the Norse people is now at its end. We have felt the cold spray of the North Atlantic, the smoky warmth of the Longhouse, the weight of the shield, and the whispers of fate from the bowels of Yggdrasil. We have seen that the story of the Viking Age is not just a story of warriors. It is a story of the farmer's resilience, the woman's quiet strength, the engineer's genius, the merchant's cunning, and the law speaker's wisdom. The longships now rest in museums. Their elegant lines are silent testament to a bygone era. The great hulls of the yawls have returned to the earth, their mighty timbers long since rotted away, leaving only the faint outlines of their foundations. But the legacy of this age is all around us. It lives on in the languages we speak, in the places we live, and in the restless, exploratory spirit that they, more than anyone, embodied. The world they helped to forge became our own. And now, there are no more stories to tell. There is nothing left to do. The journey is over. The past can be left to its quiet rest, and you can allow yourself to do the same. Let the last echoes of the story fade away. Let the deep quiet settle around you, and drift gently, peacefully, into a deep and untroubled sleep. Sleep well.